Good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are in the world. If you are in the lobby, please do join the session. So there'll be a button to join the session. You might be able to watch in the lobby, but if you can come into the session, that would be great. I can see people joining now. That's awesome. Just because it will give us a little bit more interactivity as well. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So welcome to this session on empathy and conflict. I'm joined by Dr. Claire Yorke, who is a great friend of Empathy Week, is an empathy advisor to us, is a postdoctoral fellow, researches empathy and diplomacy, and she's going to be able to add a little bit more than what I can to that. And we're going to have a discussion this evening about, can empathy as a skill help us navigate conflict? I'm really excited about this because I go to Claire when I've got certain questions about empathy, and it helps advise me. So if you're here, you're going to hopefully learn a lot. There is a Q&A function at the bottom, so please do click that. The chat is disabled just to help everyone focus and to also help us focus. But if you do want to just leave a comment as well, you can use the Q&A to do that and it will get to us. But Claire, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you for Empathy Week. It's brilliant what you're doing.
Amazing. Can you tell us more about your work, why you got interested in empathy, and then maybe lead up to sort of things that you're doing now and the research that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm currently working as a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at the University of Southern Denmark. It's a postdoctoral fellowship, and I'm looking at empathy and international security. So really exploring this idea of what does empathy mean when we think about international security and conflict and negotiations. What does it mean about how we think about security and define it, and the role of human behavior and interactions within that? And I'm also writing 2 books right now, one on empathy and diplomacy and one on empathy and political leadership. So to me, they all fit together, all around this theme of empathy and emotions as well. And I'm interested in that kind of intersection. So empathy is a lens to help us understand better different emotional facets within this space. And I got here actually through politics and policy. I originally started as a language student because I loved travel and I wanted to explore the world. So I studied a couple of languages. And then I got into politics as my first job after university, and worked for 3 years in the British Parliament. And then after that worked in Chatham House, which is a London-based international affairs think tank. And then realized through that empathy was something that kept coming up, but we didn't really necessarily talk about it in the way that I felt it should be talked about. There was a lot of understanding and knowledge of the world, but it didn't necessarily translate into the discussions that we were having. There were certain politics and obstacles. And so then I did my PhD on empathy and diplomacy. And that really has enabled me to delve even more into some of these questions that I find really fascinating. And conflict is especially, it's so pertinent, and it's something that affects all of our lives in various different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we wanted to do today was talk about conflict from maybe a localized level, something that you might have in your personal relationships and your work relationships, but also all the way up to an international level, which I suppose is probably the most obvious example, and with conflict going on in the world today. And how does your work, I suppose, and the books that you're writing as well, what have you sort of been doing in terms of conflict on an international level, and how can empathy have a role in diffusing conflict that we're seeing internationally? And I suppose, not to add more questions onto the question, but in different areas of the world, how does that change as well?
Yeah, big questions. So do jump in if I don't address all of them or if I forget a part of them. So conflict is an inevitable part of human interaction. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that is a part of our interactions with other people. And empathy is particularly pertinent to conflict because it's one of the means that we can use to navigate through conflict. It's a way of trying to understand the sources of conflict, the sources of difference, to try and see point from different perspectives to see how maybe a situation might look if we're on a different side, if we've got a different context, if we're experiencing different dimensions of something. But it's also, conflict presents so many challenges in the context of empathy, because it's precisely when you're in conflict that you really don't necessarily lean most naturally towards empathy. Conflict is normally associated with very intense emotions. And also, if we're talking about international conflict and we're talking about war, we're talking about violence, we're talking about all sorts of horrific things that are going on that accompany conflict, it's incredibly hard to then say, we need to have empathy here. We need to be able to understand the person who is perpetrating these crimes, these atrocities against us, who is maybe responsible for the loss of homes, for the loss of livelihoods, for the loss of lives, and for a huge amount of trauma. And so there's this incredible tension that we see between empathy and conflict. And that's what I'm particularly interested in. But accompanying that, if we look at the lessons from a number of wars in the past, it's empathy that a lot of people point to that is necessary and essential in order to get out of that conflict. So, for example, one of the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, Robert McNamara, he was working for a number of presidents in the kind of 50s and 60s in various capacities, but he was Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, and he observed that we really need to have empathy. My lesson from my period in office, which he didn't necessarily practice when he was in office, but when he left office, he said we should have empathized with the enemy, because if we'd have empathized with the Vietnamese that the Americans were fighting, then we would have understood that the way we projected the conflict was not the conflict that they were fighting. And that would have then changed the nature of the engagement. And we've seen this as well in a number of other conflicts with Afghanistan. There's a very prominent general in the United States called General McMaster, and he writes about the need for empathy towards the Chinese, towards the Iranian. But this also is a different kind of empathy. And so it's really worth differentiating the kind of empathy that we talk about when we're discussing how we engage with our friends or how we engage with family over a dinner table when maybe there's a conflict there, to that more strategic political empathy, which we should think about in the context of this is what government should be doing. This is what they should be practicing as a way to better understand the nature of the conflict that they're facing. So in a lot of my work, I create these different forms of empathy, interpersonal empathy, but also strategic political empathy. And this is exactly what is needed to try and understand, how does the enemy think? How are we going to defeat them if we don't understand them? And so doing that work to really see how does this look like from other perspectives is critical.
I'm going to go into that, what you've just said there, because it's so interesting. When I speak to different people, they have different definitions of empathy, and I think those that are in the empathy field understand that there are various different types of empathy, and people define it in different ways, much like I often compare it to leadership, and it's not that Oxford definition of just feeling what others feel. It's a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated than that, and contextual as well. So strategic or political empathy is, as you said, how would you define that, and what are the key kind of components of that structure of empathy, would you say?
So in many ways, it's the same as how we would define the more interpersonal, normal form of empathy. It's about it's about understanding, seeking to understand the experiences, perspective, context, the socioeconomic and cultural environment within which another country, another group of people, maybe an enemy or an ally is in, but also how they feel. What do they give meaning to? What are the stories that they tell themselves? And especially in the context of states, what is the story that they tell themselves about their identity, about who they are, and about how that is respected and reflected by others who interact with them? But a critical part of strategic empathy, as I would argue with other forms of empathy, is this capacity for self-reflection, that those who are trying to empathize with another can also reflect on themselves and understand, how am I experienced by this other actor, these other people? And also, not only in this moment right now, but when we're looking at international conflict, how might the past exchanges and experiences of our countries, for example, inform the way in which the other side might perceive me? Do they trust me? Do they trust the actions of our states? Do they have reason to believe that we will deliver on our promises? Have we got histories of conflict, and how did that go? And so it's that idea of self-reflection is also really key. It's not just about understanding it from their point of view, but seeing it as an interaction, a relationship that informs one another, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. And we've spoken about this before in a little bit of detail, not to put you under the spot, but why we care about certain conflicts more than others. I mean, I have my own thoughts to it, which I can maybe add afterwards, but that was something that's definitely come up from what we've seen in Ukraine and Russia, and why Europeans now all of a sudden are more, you know, maybe to other people seen as more giving or more caring. What is it that links empathy and conflict, and how we interact with different stories and different wars across the world?
No, that's a great question. It's a big question, and I would love to hear your perspectives on this too afterwards. In the literature on empathy, and you have a lot of psychologists, neuroscientists who point to this dimension of empathy where we tend to empathize most with those that we see as closest to us, either geographically, or maybe we feel that their identity is closest to ours. So there is this kind of selection of, I care for people because I can see myself in them. I can see that their struggle is the struggle that I am going through, or that I might go through. But it also then, the selectivity can be very problematic as well. And we saw this as well with the refugees who came from Ukraine, who were welcomed as they should have been. But then you saw other people from other countries say, we didn't receive that kind of welcome. We didn't experience that hospitality. And that can therefore lead to a certain element of mistrust, and also frustration and anger. Why did certain people get treated one way and we did not? It's not about there being limited resources. It's about this feeling of being more deserving. And I think part of it is to do, there are certain prejudices that are obviously presenting challenges within that, but also it's about the stories that are told in the media, and about the reasons behind the conflict, and the kind of narrative that's crafted about why these people are fleeing the conflict. And one of the things we've seen with Ukraine within the media is how closely it's been connected with a broader Western narrative about freedom and about the values that we hold dear, that we didn't see in the media in relation to other conflicts. And there's also the dimension that there is only so much that people can often hold. And when the news is so negative, or it feels like there are constant crises, and right now it feels like there are a lot of different challenges that we're facing, whether that's conflict or climate change or inequality and other forms of violence, people only have a certain bandwidth. And that kind of idea of empathic burnout is real, compassion burnout too. So how then can we make some of these other conflicts resonate more with people, so that, but also not overburden people so that they can't deal with anything and become empathetic? And finding that balance where we can share the stories to have far more care and far more proactive approaches to help those in need in other conflicts that aren't receiving the attention, but also at the same time help people not feel like they're being overwhelmed and therefore unable to act at all on any front. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I mean, yeah, you've covered it, and I definitely agree with you. And I bring it back to, I don't know, anyone watching this, if you've ever been to a marathon in a big city and you watch people with the charities that they're running for, or anyone that's doing a fundraiser. And I think a marathon is a good example because you see thousands of people. And I think if you would stop any single one of those people that are running and ask them why they're running for that charity or why they're raising money for that organization, they would say it's because someone close to them has been affected. And I think that's, when you look at war and you look at conflict, it's that idea that Ukraine for Europeans is that, or to the West, or the West ideology, is that much closer. It's that much closer to home. It's, you know, war shouldn't be happening in Europe. And it is this mindset of, okay, wars that happen in the Middle East are further away. It's not really to do with us. And they're different religion and different, all of these sort of things that make people give a reason to not want to empathize or want to understand as much. And I think it comes down to also natural genetic wiring. You know, we 400-500 years ago, we weren't traveling, let's just even say 30 years ago, you couldn't live stream anything. You couldn't even see, there wasn't social media as it is even 10 years ago. And I think that's the difference now, is that, you can see the world around us, and we are being bombarded with every type, although we have our little echo chambers of the algorithms that are made from our social media. We still can, if we want to, see someone from any race, religion, creed, background, country. Whereas before, historically, we've lived in groups where people look like us, they sound like us, and it's easy to connect. It's easy to empathize with your family over someone that doesn't speak another language with you, just naturally, because of communication barriers and all sorts. And I think what's interesting from my point of view, from an Empathy Week perspective as well, is that every year I ask teachers, what film did your school like the most? Just out of curiosity. And it's nothing to do with which is better made cinematically or which has better sections. It's always to do with, they always say, our students connected with this one more because of this. And that's great, and it's interesting. But actually, the whole point of Empathy Week is also to help students empathize with those that are different to them. And I had a teacher in Mexico or in Latin America say to me, "Oh, it'd be great if you could do an Empathy Week series that was in Latin America, so that our students could connect more." And I kind of sent a nicely worded email back, being like, of course, like eventually we want to film across the world and every continent, every country. But also the point of this is that it is difficult maybe, and it is hard. And I think that's the part when it comes to conflict, is that we only have so much capacity and energy to empathize, and we do have that switch. We can turn it on and off, and I think that's why it's so important to train it as a skill. But it comes down to that natural, I see someone that looks like me, or someone that lives in a similar apartment to me, or just even just all these little cues that can make you feel more connected. And I think you're absolutely right. The media has such a strong play on how we feel that we don't even realize it. And that can have, I think, huge impact on the way we act. But in terms of answers, we would obviously love to care equally for everyone else. And I think, just to add on that, what we do with our program is, for students in schools, we have empathy for myself and we have empathy for others. I think often we always think about empathy for others when we talk about empathy, but actually this idea of empathy for myself is, okay, what happened in my life up till now? What are all the experiences, all of the things that have happened? Where have I been? Where have I visited? Who have I spoken to? Who have I made friends with? All of these past experiences actually make up who you are today. And the more you have variation in that past, the more likely you are to be able to empathize with someone who's different than you. That's almost like the purpose of Empathy Week, right? If we can expose students to all of these people from around the world through the power of film, by the time they go into the real world, and they're not like, oh my gosh, who are you? You're a refugee. Like, they're actually like, oh, I remember learning about a refugee once, Habib, a few years ago or whatever. And they're curious and they ask questions. And I think if we can acknowledge ourselves, actually, how much experience we've had or how much we've pushed ourselves in the past to try and learn about other people, that is what's going to benefit society moving forward. The problem is that requires time and effort. And I think we're also in a time-poor world. No matter what job you do, everything seems rushed, and without time and without that space, you can't even start to empathize with someone properly. So it's almost like, how do we create these pockets in society where we can actually meet each other, that isn't just online watching a video of someone? Don't know where to go with that now.
No, it's fascinating. And I'm just thinking about how, like you said, with the media, one of the challenges right now is the news is so bite-sized. We have our tweets, we have 240 posts. I think it's just gone up actually, but we have, everything is accessible, it's quick, it's top headline. But the problem is, if you want to tell the story of some of these conflicts, and you want to be able to show the humanity that we share, the fact that this could be anyone, it's a matter of geography, that it's here and not there, that you need to be able to tell bigger stories, more detailed stories, so that people understand what people are going through, rather than being reduced. And you see some of the headlines in the media about conflicts where it very much reduces it to this top line. It's often the worst thing, but then you look at the generosity, you look at the people who come forward during crises, during conflicts. So many people try to help, so many people are generous and donate more, even if they're nowhere near the actual conflict zone. You see a huge amount of people donating money and offering resources and offering food and blankets and all sorts. So there's it's the capacity is there. It's that we have to make these stories available and connect them with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at my notes because we've talked about selectivity, right? Conflict resolution in a more localized sense. So let's because we're talking about education, let's talk about in a classroom, and let's talk about teachers and education, and this can probably relate to offices and small teams. How do you, especially I think when you're stuck in a team, right, with someone, because it always sounds easier and people are gonna be like, yeah, that sounds really easy, but when you're stuck in a scenario where you can't actually physically remove yourself from a scenario, how do you navigate conflict? What are the tools that empathy can teach us, and how can we use empathy to in some way help us navigate conflict with a peer or a family member or a friend?
It's a familiar question. I think it's something that everybody has encountered in some different way. One of the first things is to take a step back, to almost just take an objective stance, really be conscious of how am I feeling about this? Because in those conflicts, if it is something that feels very personal, we can then have this emotional reaction that can blind us to maybe seeing things more objectively. And I'm a huge believer that emotions are forms of data, that they inform judgment, that they're not something purely irrational that we should dismiss, but there can be in those moments of conflict far more heightened emotions that you have to just think about. Take a step back, understand what you're feeling, and try to, one of the things that I was taught when I first started one of my jobs was, don't take these things personally. And I think that's key. As much as you can, sometimes it may feel personal, that it may be that actually you're dealing with something that is very targeted at you personally, but if it's not, try and not take it personally. I think as well, how do we think through the situation from a different perspective? And so empathy gives you this different lens. What might it look like from the other side? What is it that they've raised when they're highlighting what their dissatisfied is, what their source of conflict is? Where is that coming from? Is it coming from maybe something that they're dealing with outside of the workplace or outside of the school or the classroom that they're bringing into this space because they can't express it anywhere else? Is it to do with events that have gone on? Is it maybe to do with something that I've missed? How do you try and, so empathy can help you to collect that kind of data. What am I understanding from their perspective? And then also, what maybe have I done in this? Let me reflect on how they might be experiencing me. How am I engaging with this? How is my language towards them? And a big thing that I talk about with empathy is it's the way it's communicated. You can disagree, but do you communicate in a way that is respectful? And you can set boundaries and you can assert disagreement and be very honest without being unkind. And I think maybe in the international conflict, it becomes harder, but in the local conflict, it's how do you then do that? You know, I disagree with your point, but let me understand where you're coming from. Can you maybe explain how you see this? And then try to engage it with as much kind of kindness and honesty as you can. And then are there points of commonality? Maybe it's not something you can resolve very quickly, but are there maybe easy steps that you can take that maybe offer you a route in, that find areas where you do overlap? Maybe the bigger issue is something that has to wait, but are there ways in which you can find cooperation? And sometimes it might also be about asking for a third party to just say, what are we missing? What is it that maybe we're not seeing? And get some kind of mediation, provided they're neutral and it doesn't further exacerbate the challenge. I don't know what you experienced in school when you were teaching. If you had any examples.
I love it. Just from what you're saying there, communication and commonality, I think is so key, because when I've done workshops or I've worked with organizations as well, and you probably experienced this as well. One of the first things I always get is that someone says, I'm too empathetic. like that's their problem. They always say that they're too empathetic, and actually they're in this session which is about empathy and they're like, actually I feel too much, or I'm involved too much. And I always try and actually we it tends to be that it's emotional contagion a lot of the time, and that they're just on without actually really practicing that skill of empathy. But I love the fact that what you said there about communication and commonality, because yeah, okay, great if you're working to understand, but actually how do you communicate that? And then the ways forward, as you said, okay, once you've communicated that in a good way, commonality and common ground, because that's what builds connection, right? And relationships builds trust and all that stuff. In terms of school, do you mean with students and what I saw as a teacher?
Yeah. Did you have any instances?
In how I built empathy, or how?
Did you have any instances where empathy maybe helped with a conflict that you were dealing, that maybe the students were in your class, maybe there were tensions among?
Yeah, I mean, anyone that's maybe listened to a podcast, I haven't done that many, but a few, I always talk about this group of young men called the U Gang, which they gave themselves that name, but I was teaching them. I inherited them in year 11, which for those that aren't in the UK, as we have kind of an international audience, they're students that are 15 years old at the start of that year, and they're doing the biggest exams of their life that year. And the school that I was teaching them decided to put 24 of these young men at a school of 1,600 students, mixed state, North London school. And we put 24 of these boys that were all failing, that were all kind of just didn't have a direction, into my science class for a year. I should have had 2 years with them, had a year, and it was kind of like, really, let's put them in this class to stop them disrupting every other class. So you got 2 boys from this class, 3 boys from that class, 4 boys from that class, put them all together. And, on paper, I'm just so different from them. Basically, one being, I think there was one English national in there. Lots of them had come over from, their parents had come over. Some of them were refugees. Some of them had seen things that probably I didn't realize at the time were pretty horrific. And I had to bond with them in a way where they just didn't care at all, really, about science. Or I thought that's what it was at the start. But then I realized it's just they didn't want to fail, that they'd been told kind of that. They realized that they were in this group because it didn't make sense, the group. They're not stupid. They're like, okay, why have they put all of us together when we all love messing around and we get told off? They were on reports. So stuff in British schools is where you have like a behavior report. At one point out of the 24, I think I had 16 reports, and 7 of them were red, which meant last chance before you're kicked out of school. And I just remember the usual ways of teaching them is just not going to work. They don't care. They're not going to listen. So I used to show them basketball videos. I play basketball. They all generally played basketball. And I had the kind of connection. I had that talk about commonality. I had the commonality of, if I put them on a basketball court, they knew that I could beat them. Yeah. And that was weird for them, because I was just like white, geeky, a bit weird science teacher who loves chemistry. And then I step on a basketball court and they're like, what? I remember the first time I went to go and coach at the school, they thought it was a joke. They're like, what's this guy doing here, sort of thing. And I was like, for them, their minds are just blown that like someone can like science and also like basketball, because the cultures just didn't go together. So I used to show them like motivational videos, and then it actually weirdly became some sort of reward. They're like, oh, can we watch the Kevin Durant one if we get this work done? And also just with science experiments, I used to just take it into my own hands a little bit. And the group 1 metals, I'm getting a bit geeky now, but they're in reactivity series, and if you throw them in water, the explosions get more and more and more. And they used to be like, cut a bigger bit, sir, and like throw it in, and just actually risk a little bit, in the sense of, I'm still their teacher, there's still those boundaries, but have a bit of fun. Yeah. And over time, that broke down some barriers where I realized that they started to believe in themselves a little bit more, because they believed that I believed in them. And it was a very long process, and it was a really difficult process, and it wasn't perfect. They were called the U Gang because they all got ungraded. They didn't get any grade in their mock exams, but they all left with a grade. Now that sounds amazing, but some of them still got E's, which is not great. but they all left with something. They had a GCSE, and one of them was even in a prison cell the day of his chemistry exam. He was like arrested, and so literally missed the exam because of being physically in a cell, and he couldn't get to the exam. And then comes in and is like, "Can I do it?" And I'm like, "No, like, I'm not joking when you say you can't do these things." So I learned a lot through that, and actually that group is part of the inspiration for me starting Empathy Week, because I realized with that group of young men, had they seen a world outside of their little borough in North London where many of them were involved in gangs, or their aspirations were to make money on the street or whatever, because that was what they saw. But actually and in the newspaper, they would be seen as predominantly young black gang members or whatever, and that's how papers would write about them. But in my lesson, okay, they're not perfect, and they, at one point they were heating up tongs and they were trying to, like, cripple each other and things, and I had to change things up. But they over time they were actually there, and they were trying to learn. And I realized that came actually about, and I didn't realize at the time, but I was deploying empathy. What's going on at home? How's mum? How's your brother? Did you watch the basketball game last night? All these just general chit chat, which I think we lost over COVID as well, that actually builds connection over time. And I think it is that you're still going to get conflict, and they're still not going to like certain elements. But I think that it makes even more sense now speaking to you, like the way that I communicated and the way that I found commonality really helped me to navigate what was quite a toxic, and some, it was never perfect. It wasn't like this curt line. It was very much like this. Yeah. One day they'd be like, in the playground, having to sometimes physically restrain some of them, and they'd be like, "I don't care," and then they would come and apologize. But I think that's relationships, and I think that's conflict, and I think there'll be many teachers that can understand what I'm talking about with certain classes and certain groups. But then I realized that actually we're not educating people around this. We're not educating people to be in emotional intelligence, in social emotional learning. And actually, if we do, then the students themselves can recognize actually the way that I'm acting isn't right. And actually, my teacher isn't understanding me, and maybe that partly on me as well. So I think the more we can talk about it, and the more that we can actually emphasize the importance of communicating in the right way, the more the world's going to see less conflict and more resolution.
And I love that example. And I think it's a testament to your teaching and your investment in education that it had that impact. But it also reveals a few more things about empathy, which you touch on. You treated all these guys as with dignity. You recognized that they were more than just that ungraded report card that they were getting, that they were young men who had their own ambitions, their own lives. And I think when we think about empathy and conflict, especially, you can be at conflict and still try wherever possible to treat the other side with dignity and a certain amount of respect. And again, at the international level, it can get harder. But I think at the local level, there's a way that you can treat other people. And I noticed as well, there's a question about how empathy can help with trust and reduce defensiveness. And I think exactly that, if you start to invest in people and you also look beyond the surface, you didn't take them at face value, you didn't take them at maybe the anger, the frustration they were feeling, you saw the kind of humanity and the stories behind that. And that's really key with empathy. You've got to have curiosity, and curiosity is such a critical element of empathy. Look at what's lying below the surface. And this holds as true for international negotiations and diplomacy as it does in local conflict. What are people not saying? And I often think it's not only what are they saying officially, what is between the lines? And that's where you often get to some of the more meaningful and symbolic dimensions of what's really going on. Why are they quiet about certain things? How is it that they're expressing themselves, and what maybe lies beneath that we need to investigate further? And often you don't investigate that further by going straight in and saying, what are you not telling me? Because that requires trust. But by going, okay, well, there's something here. What's the way round? How do we connect? And in terms of conflict resolution, using empathy in that, often you'll see in international diplomacy, mediators will find rooms and venues where they can get two sides to start to see each other as maybe they're both parents, maybe they're both grandparents. There's a great film called Oslo, which is about the Oslo peace process. And in that, you see the Norwegian mediators setting up the negotiations very much to make sure that the Israelis and the Palestinian representatives would see the other side and would see that they had things in common. And they would use things like meal times and humor and people relaxing. And I think when that comes to the school and the local level, it's how do you start to get around like you did with basketball? You just take them out the classroom, you find something that they can bond over and that you can connect with them on. And that's, I think, the power of empathy, is the ability to look below the surface and really try and figure out what's going on underneath.
Yeah, and I really think about what you said there about environment. So simple. I know that as a filmmaker, if I show you a film on my phone with like poor 3G or whatever, and it's like breaking up and there's noise and traffic, and it's the same film, it's not going to be as impactful as if you watched it in a cinema when you've got surround sound. And we don't think about that with our interactions and when we have conversations and who we have them with, and at what time of the day, and understanding what's going on. And I think environment is a really crucial one for school, but really difficult one for school because you're so limited in your environment because you've got all of these students in one place. Just to make sure, so that question from Larissa in Moldova, thank you so much for asking it. She said, in what ways can empathy help us build trust and reduce defensiveness during conflict resolution? I just want to make sure that we've answered that. So in particular, the building trust and reducing defensiveness, you've said very much, I think, about environment, commonality, and the way we communicate. Is there anything else that can really help us build trust with people?
So empathy and trust are often spoken about in the literature as connected, because if you start to show someone that you are trying to understand them, even if you don't understand them yet, even if you're still working on it, if you can start to express to people, I see you, I hear you, I'm listening, I care. And you don't have to say that explicitly, but through your gestures, through your actions, you start to express that. Then the other person will start to say, okay, this person is invested in a resolution, is invested in my perspective. I think if you start to talk over people and you start to kind of steamroller a conversation, then that gives very little space for the other side to feel that they're being listened to and heard. And so some of the exercises that we see about empathic listening, and listening again is another critical function of empathy, but really listening to hear and not just to respond. So are you creating a space where people can genuinely air their grievances and where you can then listen and reflect on what you've heard, listen to what's not being said, and maybe dug a little bit deeper? And trust and empathy are both processes. It is not something that you will win outright. It's not something that you can get immediately. Sometimes you may meet someone that you connect with and it's an immediate sense of, you get me, I can work with you. But often it's something that is built up over time that really needs an investment and patience, and that commitment to keep showing up and keep being curious and keep listening and learning and reflecting on yourself at the same time.
Absolutely. What is the best, if you're in all the research you've done and what you're looking at now and past and present, is there like a specific story or example, and it might be of one person where they've really utilized the power of empathy to pull off something huge? So whether that's a peace agreement between countries, or maybe it's even smaller, but is there a real like stick out example where you've read and you've been like, crikey, that's like amazing? And that's a real example of how all of these things have connected together to form a really positive outcome.
Yeah, I mean, a huge amount of my work focuses on these human relations. And often you do find it is that two people just suddenly connected in ways that no one expected. And one of the interesting ones is the Northern Ireland peace process, where you had Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, who were on opposite sides of what was a bloody conflict. A lot of people lost their lives. There was a huge amount of trauma. And they somehow, over time, it was not immediate, they were very much enemies, and they started to see their shared humanity. They started to connect. And then as the process went on, there were stories about how Martin McGuinness would go to Ian Paisley to pray about relatives. They apparently had this very close sense of humor that they would share. they got very close. But one of the challenges with that is that they didn't necessarily, everyone around them was not necessarily sharing in that bond. So the empathy that they shared would go so far, and it did. I mean, we got the Northern Ireland peace process as a result of that kind of commitment to that relationship. But it then had a certain kind of limitation in that not everybody else had the same relationship. So it's about how do you infuse the broader network, the community, with that empathy, which is a much bigger task. But I always think that's a great one. And I think as well, looking, for example, at Nelson Mandela in South Africa and that capacity that he demonstrated to really try and bring people together and unite them around a common identity. And again, both of these instances, there are films about them if you want an easy access to kind of see what it is. Films like Invictus, for example, show the power of sport to bring different people together and to create that common identity. Yeah, there's a lot. There are a lot. I love these different kind of stories.
Yeah, amazing. And actually, what you've just mentioned there about Northern Ireland as well reminds me, shameless plug, but tomorrow we have Joe Berry doing a session who talks about empathy as a tool for bridging peace. And her father was killed in the IRA bombing in the 80s of the Brighton Hotel, and she connected then with Pat McGee, the man that planted that bomb in 2000. So the man that killed her father, and she has since shared a stage with him, talking all over the world about peace and empathy. And she shared a stage with him, I believe, now nearly 400 times, which is just phenomenal. And I always use it as like a really prime living example of how empathy can, if you can, I don't know how Joe does it, but if you can really like commit to that process of trying to really understand another person. And Pat talks about, we're not joined by Pat tomorrow, unfortunately, just Joe, but Pat talks about how Joe's empathy disarmed him from his political ideology. There he was wanting to be understood by someone else, probably the person that should least want to do that. So do tune into that session tomorrow with Joe. But really, really great examples of how empathy can be used. Yeah,
it's really inspiring. It does reflect again, though, the timing, because to get to that point, empathy is deeply uncomfortable and deeply confrontational in a conflict situation. It's exactly what we do not want to be doing sometimes. And so I think the capacity to get there is so inspiring, but I know that it must have taken a huge amount of time and effort to be able to get to a place where you've processed the pain and the hurt that accompanied the kind of the trauma of losing a loved one, and then you're able to move beyond it and recognize that there's something bigger that you can contribute. But yeah,
amazing. And crucially also, there were mediators and people involved in the environment and all of those things that we talked about, commonality and communication and all of those things, and time. I think what people underestimate is time. We think now in this kind of world where we want instant likes and gratification, and people, like you're saying, retweet articles that they haven't even read, but the headline's there, and so they just retweet them. And I've been guilty of doing that once or twice myself, and then realized that I've actually what I should probably read what I've retweeted, because we all just live in that world. So it's that idea of time is so important. And talking of time, we are at time. Claire, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure I've taken a lot from this, little snippets that just, ground you in the way that you think about some of the relationships you have, how to improve them, and also how to take it forward. Thanks to everyone that's attended as well. Claire, I know you've given us a reading list as well. It's on the resources. So I think if you go onto the session, if you've signed up, obviously if you're watching this, you've signed up, so you'll be able to go back onto the platform, or find a button around where you're watching this that will show resources, and there's like a reading list. Is that right, Claire? Links and
yeah, there should be some reading list, and if not, people are welcome to reach out and I can send things via email.
Great. And people can find you on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Yes.
And we'll be able to help connect as well. So thank you so much, Claire. Always a pleasure. I'm sure we'll be talking more and more in future. And thank you to everyone that's come as well.
Oh, thank you, Ed, and thank you to everyone who's joined us and to Empathy. Good luck with it all. I think you've got such a brilliant lineup of events this week. So.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Claire. Speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.